The Whispering and the Ruins. The morning Marin climbed into the Asheville Mountains. The sky was the particular shade of gray that doesn't promise rain so much as it promises weight, the kind of overcast that sits on a landscape like a held breath, pressing everything flat and quiet beneath it. The kind of sky that made the already silent ruins of the Draveth fortress feel even more abandoned than they were, even more ancient, even more like a place that the world had agreed, by some collective and unspoken understanding, to simply forget. Marin had been told not to go there. This was not unusual. Marin had been told not to go to quite a number of places over the course of her 26 years, and she had developed a personal philosophy regarding such warnings that could be summarized simply as, "It depends on who's telling me and why." When her mother told her not to climb the elm tree in their yard at age 9, that had been reasonable, and Marin had climbed it anyway and broken her wrist and conceded the point. When the cartographer in the valley town had told her the mountain passes were unstable this time of year, that had been professional advice, and she had taken a different route. But when the innkeeper's son, a boy of perhaps 17 who had never in his life ventured further than the millpond, told her with wide theatrical eyes that the old fortress was cursed and that things lived there and that sensible folk kept their distance, Marin had nodded politely, finished her tea, adjusted the straps of her pack, and left before sunrise. She was a mapmaker's assistant by trade and a curious person by nature, and the two qualities had long since fused into something she couldn't separate anymore even if she'd wanted to. The unexplored corner of a map was not a warning to Marin. It was an invitation written in absence. The trail up to the fortress was not really a trail at all. It was more an agreement between the mountain's natural geography and the persistent desire of humans to reach high places. A suggestion of flattened ground here, a convenient ledge there, stones that happened to be stacked at intervals that approximated steps. Whoever had built the fortress had been practical about access once. Now the path was overgrown with the kind of vegetation that seems to exist specifically to reclaim what humans have abandoned. Low, determined shrubs with woody roots that cracked between flagstones, pale grass growing sideways from the walls, and a species of climbing vine with small waxy leaves that had colonized the lower portions of every standing structure so thoroughly that it was difficult to say where the stone ended and the plant began. Marin climbed for 2 hours in the gray morning quiet. She was not afraid. She was, if she examined herself honestly, and she made a habit of this, alert in the way that a person becomes alert in unfamiliar terrain, a low and constant attentiveness that lives just behind the eyes, registering small changes in light, sound, and the quality of the air without requiring conscious attention. Her boots were good. Her pack was balanced. She had water, food enough for the day, a rolled map, 2 pencils, a notebook, and the small brass compass her father had given her the year before he died, which she kept in her left breast pocket where she could feel it against her ribs when she breathed deeply. She felt it now as she crested the last rise and stopped. The fortress opened before her. It was larger than she had imagined, even accounting for the ruin, perhaps especially because of the ruin. Intact buildings conceal their own scale behind orderly walls and purposeful lines, but when a structure falls, it spreads, and what the Draveth fortress had become in 3 centuries of quiet collapse was a vast and sprawling field of intention. She could read it like a text. Here had been a gatehouse, 2 towers flanking an arch that was now only half an arch. The missing side a rubble slope of dark stone blocks that had tumbled and settled into a permanent arrangement as natural-looking as a glacial moraine. Beyond it, the main hall, roofless, opened to the gray sky, its floor perhaps 30 feet below the level where she stood, accessible by what had once been a ceremonial staircase and was now a reckless series of crumbling platforms. Flanking the hall on either side, the remnants of secondary structures. A long building she guessed had been a barracks, another that might have been a stable or a granary, both reduced to their lowest courses of stone, their interiors open and overgrown with moss so thick and so deeply green it looked almost black in the flat morning light. Marin stood at the top of the rubble slope and took it in. She took out her notebook and made a rough sketch, not with any professional precision, just the instinctive gesture of a person who thinks better with a pencil in hand, organizing the space through the act of rendering it. She noted the compass orientation, the approximate dimensions, the surviving architectural features. She noted the silence, which was the particular silence of a place where human sound had been absent long enough that the natural world had re-established its own acoustic register. The distant call of a raptor somewhere above the clouds, the slow percussion of wind moving through stone gaps, the occasional tick and shift of rock cooling or settling in ways that had nothing to do with her presence. Then she descended into the great hall. She was careful on the stairs, testing each step before committing her weight, keeping one hand against the wall. The stone was cold and damp and left a gray smear on her palm. Twice she stopped to sketch particular details. a carved lintel that had survived intact, depicting figures she couldn't quite identify, and a section of the original floor that emerged from beneath the moss near the base of the stairs, its paving stones still fitted with a tightness that impressed her even after 300 years of neglect. She reached the floor of the hall and walked its length slowly, stepping around the larger debris, ducking under a section of collapsed roofing timber that had somehow never fully fallen, suspended at a steep diagonal by a stone buttress that had not entirely given way. The open sky above was the same steady gray, and in the diffused light everything in the hall had the quality of something seen underwater, present and detailed but somehow drained of color, as though the ruins existed in a slightly different version of the world than the one she had walked up from. At the far end of the hall she found the collapsed archway. It was the largest of the ruins, the arch that must have connected the hall to whatever structure had once stood behind it, probably a keep or a great tower now entirely gone. The arch itself had fallen inward, and the debris formed a deep alcove of sorts, a shadowed overhang of interlocking stone blocks that had settled into something resembling stability even in their disorder. The space beneath them was perhaps 12 feet deep and 8 feet high at its tallest point, and it was cool and dark and smelled of stone and moss and something else, something faintly mineral, vaguely warm, like the inside of a kiln that has been empty for a long time but still holds the ghost of its last firing. Marin noted this smell without categorizing it. She was looking at the moss on the fallen arch, which was different from the moss covering the rest of the floor, thicker, more extensively colonized, and in one place worn away in a wide oval shape as though something large had lain on it repeatedly. She crouched and examined this detail with the methodical interest of someone building a picture from small pieces, not yet certain what picture she was building. She was still crouching, pencil hovering over her notebook, when she heard the first sound. It was not a sound she knew. That was the first thing that registered, not fear, not recognition, but the clear and immediate awareness that this fell outside her established categories. It was thin, almost inaudible, pitched at the upper edge of her hearing where sounds become more sensation than noise. She straightened slowly and tilted her head, the way she always did when trying to locate a sound directionally, and the movement seemed to clarify it. A kind of reedy whisper, not quite like wind, not quite like any animal she had encountered in her years of traveling through wilderness. She stood perfectly still and listened. The sound resolved, slowly in the way that an image emerges from fog, not all at once but in accumulating increments, an edge here, a shape there, until suddenly you are seeing what was always present. The sound became recognizable as voices. Plural, small, overlapping. I am speaking. Marin had a moment of complete cognitive stillness. The kind that happens when the brain receives information it has no existing framework for and has to pause briefly all other processing while it decides how to proceed. She stood in the middle of the ruined great hall in the gray morning light and understood, with a clarity that felt almost absurd in its quietness, that something in the shadow of the collapsed archway was having a conversation. She moved, not toward the sound, not immediately, but sideways, angling herself to a position that gave her a better sightline into the alcove while keeping a collapsed wall between her and whatever was inside it. She moved slowly. She moved the way she had learned to move around nervous animals. No sudden gestures, no direct approach, weight shifted forward onto the balls of her feet so each step could be retracted if necessary. She found a ledge, the remains of a low secondary wall, perhaps waist-high, running parallel to the far side of the hall, and she crouched behind it and looked. The voices were clearer now. She's been standing there for a long time, one said. This voice had a particular quality she could only describe as young, not in any way she could have pointed to precisely, but in the same instinctive way that one can hear youth in a human voice, a certain untempered quality, a lack of the rounded edges that time and experience press into speech. I can hear her breathing. You can't hear her breathing from here, said a second voice, this one slightly lower, slightly more certain of itself. You think you can, but you can't, you're imagining it. I can. You can't. Lies. Both of you, said a third voice, and this one was quieter than the other two, more measured, carrying a particular quality of deliberateness, like someone who has learned that speaking more softly is more effective than speaking more loudly. Stop it. She's still there, I can smell her. A pause. She smells like bread, the first voice said reverently. She smells like bread and dried meat and something sweet, the second voice corrected, with the pedantic precision of someone committed to accuracy even when it served no purpose. Figs, possibly, or dates, I can't tell at this distance. She has food, the first voice said, and the reverence deepened into something that could only be described as longing. A pure, uncomplicated, almost musical longing that Marin, crouched behind the low wall with her pencil frozen in her hand and her heart beating in a very strange way, found almost painfully familiar. It was the sound of hunger spoken aloud without any attempt at dignity, the kind of hunger that belongs specifically to the very young before pride teaches them to disguise it. Yes, the third voice said quietly, she has food. Another pause, longer this time. We could ask, the first voice offered. We couldn't ask, the second voice said, horrified. We can't just walk up to a human and ask for their food. They run. They always run or they throw things. She hasn't run yet. She doesn't know we're here yet. The careful one is right, the third voice said with that same quiet deliberateness. We don't approach, we agreed. We agreed, the second voice confirmed with some reluctance. But the first voice said, and Marin could hear in it the unmistakable inflection of a young creature constructing an argument it has been thinking about for longer than it is about to let on. What about the leaving, the after part? When a traveler leaves a campsite, what remains behind? Silence. Leftovers, the second voice said slowly. Leftovers, the first voice agreed with quiet triumph. Mother said we must not take what belongs to a human, but what has been left behind, what the human no longer wants or needs, that is not taking, that is finding. The food has been released. It belongs to the air. A longer silence. That is extremely convenient reasoning, the third voice said, and even through all the strangeness of the moment, even crouching on the cold stone floor of a 300-year-old ruin with her heart doing unusual things in her chest, Marin recognized that the speaker had not actually disagreed with the logic, had in fact conceded the point through the very precision of the objection. Extremely convenient is not the same as wrong. We wait, the first voice said. She'll eat something, she'll leave the pieces she doesn't want. We take only those pieces. Mother cannot object to that. Mother, the second voice said, and something shifted in it. A new note, lower, more complex, isn't here. Mother is always somewhere, the third voice said immediately, and the certainty in it was absolute, and it silenced the other two completely. Marin remained where she was for a long moment. Her knees were beginning to protest the crouching position, but she did not move. She was looking at the shadow beneath the fallen archway, and slowly, with the peculiar patience of someone allowing an image to fully develop, she began to be able to see them. They were small. That was the first and most important thing, the thing her brain needed to process before it could process anything else. They were small in the way that made everything she thought she knew about what they were immediately unreliable, because everything she thought she knew about what they were involved large, vast, in fact, enormous, city-leveling, sky-darkening. These were none of those things. These were, in the shadow of the fallen arch, barely larger than a well-fed cat, 3 of them, arranged in a loose cluster, their bodies low against the stone in the posture of animals trying to be smaller than they are, which she recognized immediately as the posture of animals who want something and know they are not supposed to want it and cannot help themselves. Their scales were the color of old copper going green, a dull, complex color that shifted depending on how the flat light caught them, sometimes closer to brown, sometimes a deep mossy green once when the first one turned its head and the light found it at a particular angle, briefly and startlingly gold. Their wings were folded against their backs with the tight, compressed neatness of something packed away for later. Too large for their bodies in the way that young animals are often assembled with pieces that belong to the adult they will eventually become. Wings like folded parchment, delicate-looking and faintly ridged, the bones visible beneath the membrane in a pattern that was almost architectural. Their tails were long relative to their bodies and moved continuously in small, restless motions, the tips curling and uncurling against the stone in what she recognized, after a moment of watching, as the draconic equivalent of fidgeting. Their faces were the strangest part, or rather the most affecting. The snouts were narrow and pointed in a way that would eventually, she understood on some instinctive level, become broader and heavier and more formidable, but right now they were sharp and expressive, the nostrils flaring with extraordinary mobility as they continued to analyze the air between themselves and her. Their eyes, all 6 of them oriented in her direction, were amber. Not the amber of ordinary animal eyes, not the flat reflective gold of a cat or a fox, but something deeper and more internally lit, as though the color itself had a source, as though there was something behind the iris that generated the light rather than merely reflecting it. It was, Marin thought with a strange feeling she could not name, a very old kind of eye in a very young face. She looked at them for a long time. They had not seen her, not precisely. They knew she was in the hall. They could smell her, apparently with considerable specificity. But their sight had not yet found her behind the low wall, and so they remained where they were, in their uncomfortable combination of hunger and restraint and internalized maternal instruction, whispering to each other about philosophy and leftovers and the airspace that belonged to no one. Marin became aware slowly of her own breathing, of the bread in her pack, of the dried meat and the figs. The second voice had been right, they were figs, and of the apple she had been planning to eat when she stopped for lunch, and of the way the first voice had said she smells like bread with a reverence so undisguised and so sincere that it had landed somewhere in Marin's chest and was still sitting there, warm and a little uncomfortable, like a coal she hadn't expected to find. She thought about what the third voice had said. We wait, she'll eat something, she'll leave the pieces she doesn't want. She thought about what they were waiting for specifically. Not to take, not to steal, not to frighten or threaten or demand, to wait for the discards. To construct an entire ethical framework, however convenient, that would allow them to eat the things she no longer wanted, the edges and the scraps and the bruised parts, without violating the principle that had presumably been explained to them in the serious and absolute tones that mothers use for the things that actually matter. We only take from the air. She reached into her pack. She did it slowly, with deliberate, unhurried motion, the way she would move around a deer or a hawk or any creature whose trust had to be earned in the specific currency of stillness and patience. She found the bread, a dark, dense loaf she had bought in the valley town, the kind that keeps well and travels well and tastes like something real even after a day in a pack. She found the heel of it, the end piece, the part she always saved for last because the crust was thicker there and she liked the resistance of it, and she held it for a moment and felt its weight. She stood up from behind the low wall. She did it slowly, deliberately. She rose to her full height in the gray morning light of the ruined Great Hall, and she was aware, in a way she had never been aware of before and suspected she would never be able to accurately describe afterward, of the precise quality of the silence that followed the silence of three small creatures who had been whispering and fidgeting and debating the philosophy of ownership, going absolutely, completely, breathlessly still. She looked at them. She could see them clearly now, all three, their amber eyes enormous and fixed on her with an intensity that was not predatory. That was, she thought, almost the opposite of predatory. It was the intensity of animals who want something very much and have been told very clearly by someone they respect deeply that they may not have it, and are now confronted with the impossible fact that the thing they want has apparently decided, of its own volition, to stand up and look at them. She set the heel of bread on the ledge in front of her. Set it gently, deliberately, with a small motion of placement that was, she meant it to be, even though she couldn't have said precisely why, unmistakably intentional. Not dropped, not fallen, set down, left behind, released, belonging now to the air. She stepped back, put her hands at her sides, waited. The three small figures in the shadow of the archway were motionless for one long, suspended, luminous moment. Then the smallest one, the one whose voice had built the philosophy of the air, whose reasoning had been simultaneously convenient and irrefutable, broke from the shadow with the sudden frantic grace of a lizard startled from a rock, all quick angular motion and clicking claws, scrambling up the wall toward her with a speed that made the whole thing look effortless and urgent and utterly without self-consciousness. The small wings spread once briefly for balance, a reflex more than a flight, a gesture like throwing out one's arms, and then it was on the ledge, a foot from the bread, its sides heaving with small, quick breaths, its amber eyes moving between the bread and her face with an expression that contained, in equal measure, intense want and uncertain propriety. It looked at her for a long moment. Its nostrils worked. Its tail tip made three rapid curling motions against the stone. Then it drew itself up very slightly, with a dignity entirely disproportionate to its size, and opened its small, sharp mouth. "Thank you," it said, in a whisper that was absolutely sincere, absolutely formal, and absolutely the most serious two words Marin had ever heard in her life. And it took the bread. Marin stood on the ledge in the ruined great hall of the Dravith fortress with the gray sky open above her, and something happening in her chest that she had no immediate name for, not quite laughter, not quite wonder, not quite the particular tenderness one feels for small hungry things that try very hard to be dignified. Something that was perhaps all three of those things occurring simultaneously, pressing against her ribs from the inside like a breath she was holding without meaning to. Behind the first small dragon, the other two had crept forward from the shadow, and were watching her with the careful, calculating attention of creatures trying to determine whether the situation was safe, whether the precedent had been established, and whether the particular ethical framework they had collectively endorsed approximately 4 minutes ago had in fact just been honored. She looked at them, they looked at her. The bread was gone already. The first one was sitting very straight, looking at her with those deep amber eyes and the expression of an animal that has just had a hypothesis confirmed and doesn't quite know what to do with the confirmation. Marin sat down on the ledge, cross-legged, and set her pack in her lap and reached in again. She moved deliberately, unhurried, the same way she had moved the first time, not performing casualness, but actually inhabiting it because something in the last few minutes had recalibrated her entirely, had shifted the coordinates of the morning so completely that sitting on the cold stone of a 300-year-old ruin with 3 baby dragons watching her unpack her lunch felt not merely possible but somehow strangely correct. "All right," she said quietly to no one in particular and to all three of them at once. She pulled out the figs. A negotiation of scraps. The figs were slightly bruised, which was, Marin had always maintained, the best condition for a fig to be in. A perfect fig, firm-skinned, unblemished. The kind that sat in a market stall looking architectural was a fig that had not yet understood what it was supposed to become. The bruised fig had arrived somewhere. The skin had given slightly, the interior had deepened in sweetness, the whole thing had surrendered a little of its structural dignity in exchange for something more important. She had bought 6 of them in the valley town and eaten 3 on the ascent, savoring each one in the methodical way she approached food on long walks. Not quickly, not distractedly, but with the specific attentiveness of someone who knows that the experience of eating something good in a good place is itself a kind of nourishment separate from the nutrition. She held the remaining 3 in her open palm and looked at them. Then she looked at the 3 small creatures arranged in an uneven semicircle before her on the ledge, watching her hand with an intensity that was almost gravitational. She separated the figs into 3 portions with careful deliberateness and placed one in front of each of them. What happened next was not what she expected. She had anticipated, if she had anticipated anything in a morning that had already abandoned all anticipation as a useful framework, that they would simply take the food, snatch it perhaps the way small hungry animals generally do, with a speed that suggests that the gap between having and not having must be closed before the universe changes its mind. Instead, all 3 of them looked at the figs placed before them, then looked at each other. Then, with the synchronization of creatures who had clearly been raised with a specific protocol for exactly this kind of situation, each one lowered its head briefly toward the food before touching it, a small, formal gesture, a bow so slight it might have been missed by someone not watching carefully, but Marin was watching very carefully. Only after this did they eat. They were precise about it in a way that was oddly fascinating to watch. Each one consumed its own portion completely before any of them made any motion that could be construed as attention toward another's share. There was no rushing, no gobbling, no competitive urgency. They ate the way someone eats when they have been taught that food is a matter of some seriousness, not to be wasted, not to be taken for granted, not to be consumed in a manner unbecoming. Marin watched this and felt something she could only call recognition, the quiet, slightly startled feeling of encountering unexpected evidence of familiar values in an unfamiliar form. When the figs were gone, the smallest one, the one whose voice she had privately begun to think of as the philosopher, though she did not yet know how apt this would prove, looked up at her and tilted its head to one side with a motion so precisely like the gesture of a thoughtful person that Marin nearly laughed out loud. It had amber eyes that caught what pale light came through the gray overcast and held it in a way that made it look, against all reasonable expectation, like it was thinking, not reacting. Not processing in the flat way that animals process. Thinking in the active, generative sense that implied interior architecture. You sat down, it said. The whisper was the same as before, thin, reedy, precise, but there was something different in it now. The transaction of the bread had been a test, she understood in retrospect. The figs had been a confirmation. And the sitting down, the deliberate folding of her legs, the placement of the pack in her lap, the posture that said I am not leaving immediately, that had been, apparently, something else entirely. Something that warranted comment. I did, Marin said. She kept her voice quiet, matching the register of the conversation without having consciously decided to. Travelers don't sit, the second one said. This was the voice of the pedant, the corrector, the one who had objected to extremely convenient reasoning with the precision of someone who had been paying close attention to the reasoning even as they objected to it. They move through, they look at the stones, sometimes they eat while standing, then they leave. I'm not leaving yet, Marin said. A pause. The 3 of them exchanged a look that had the quality of a conversation happening too quickly and too privately for her to follow, conducted through amber eyes and small shifts of posture and the eloquent mobility of those narrow, expressive snouts. Why? The third one asked. This was the cautious voice, the one that had said mother is always somewhere with the absolute, unarguable certainty of a creature who has internalized a truth so completely it no longer feels like a belief. It asked the question with the particular directness of someone who has decided that asking outright is more efficient than waiting to find out. Marin considered the question. It was, she thought, a better question than most humans would have thought to ask in the same situation. Most humans offered a morning like this one would have asked what are you or are you dangerous or simply run immediately without forming any question at all. This small creature had skipped all of that and gone directly to the more interesting inquiry, not what she was but why she was staying. I want to understand what this place is, she said, which was true in the general sense that had brought her up the mountain in the first place, and also increasingly true in a more specific and immediate sense. And I think you might know it better than I do. Another exchange of looks, longer this time. We've lived here for 23 days, the philosopher said, with the exact specificity of someone who has been counting and finds the count significant. 24, the pedant corrected. 23, the night we arrived was the same night as the rain, and rain nights don't count as days. That is also extremely convenient reasoning. It is accurate reasoning. A day requires light. A day requires the passage of 23 or 24 days, the cautious one said, with a patience that had the quality of something practiced regularly out of necessity, is enough to know the stones. The cold places and the warm places, the places where the wind comes through, the place where the water collects when it rains. Marin took out her notebook. She did it slowly, watching them as she did, gauging the response. The philosopher's eyes tracked the notebook with immediate and obvious interest, not alarm, but the alert orientation of a creature encountering something new and deciding rapidly whether it was threat or curiosity. After a moment, the amber gaze settled into something she would have called curiosity without hesitation if she'd been watching a child. And perhaps that wasn't, she thought, such an inaccurate comparison. "What is that?" the philosopher said, not quite a question. The inflection fell somewhere between inquiry and statement, the tone of something that wants to be told, but also wants it known that it was already in the process of figuring it out. "A notebook," Marin said. "I write things in it, observations, measurements, things I want to remember." "You remember things by writing them." "Some people do." "We remember things by," the philosopher began and then stopped, glanced at the cautious one, received some small signal, a barely perceptible shift of posture, a fractional tightening of the expression, and redirected. "We remember differently," it finished, which was clearly not what it had originally intended to say, and which contained, in its careful incompleteness, the first hint that there were things they had been instructed not to share as well as things they had been instructed not to do. Marin noted this without pressing it. She had learned in years of working with maps and the people and places that created them that the fastest way to close a door was to push it too hard. She wrote instead a brief description of the Great Hall as she could see it from her current position, and added a note about the worn patch of moss in the alcove, and did not look up from the page as she did it, giving them time to watch her write in the same unhurried way she had given them time to approach the bread. When she looked up, all three of them had moved closer. Not dramatically, not a sudden advance, but the philosopher, who had been perhaps 4 feet away, was now perhaps 2. And the pedant had settled into a position that was, she noticed, angled in such a way that it could see what she was writing on the page. "Are those words?" the pedant asked, with the tone of someone who suspects they already know the answer and wants confirmation. "Oh, yes." "We know of words," it said, with a gravity that somehow managed to convey both the significance of this knowledge and a slight uncertainty about the details. "Mother's language has words, but they are different, larger." "How do you mean larger?" The pedant considered this with evident seriousness. "When Mother says a word, it takes up more space. A human word," it gestured toward the notebook with a brief motion of its snout, "lives on a page, stays where it is put. Mother's words move in the air and stay there for a while, they push things." Marin set her pencil down. "That is one of the most interesting things anyone has ever said to me," she said with complete sincerity. The pedant appeared briefly uncertain how to respond to this, which was, Marin suspected, an unusual experience for it. "Tell me about the ruins," she said then, redirecting with the same gentle sideways pressure she'd used to navigate 100 careful conversations. "You said you know the stones, the warm places and the cold places." And that, as it turned out, was the right question. Not about them, not about what they were or where they came from or what their mother was like. About the place itself. About the stones they had been living among for 23 days or 24, depending on the philosophy of rain nights, and had presumably explored with the thoroughness that young creatures bring to any new territory. The philosopher went first, because it always went first. She was already understanding. It told her about the northern corner of the hall where something in the remaining partial roof created a channel that collected warm air from some thermal feature of the mountain, making it reliably the warmest point in the entire structure, even on cold mornings. It told her about the hidden room, accessible only through a gap in the rubble on the eastern wall that was too small for an adult human, but apparently well-sized for a small dragon, that still had most of its original floor intact and contained, against one wall, a series of carved alcoves that had probably once held oil lamps and now made excellent sleeping shelves. It told her that the stones of the original foundation, at the lowest level accessible from the barracks ruin, were a different kind of stone from the rest of the fortress, darker, older, laid without mortar in a technique that predated everything else, which suggested, the philosopher said with the confidence of someone presenting a conclusion they have arrived at through careful analysis, that someone had built something here before the humans did. Marin wrote all of this down rapidly, her pencil moving with the focused efficiency of someone transcribing information they know is valuable. And as she wrote, the other two began to contribute in their own registers. The pedant with careful corrections and clarifications and occasional interjections of "that is not precisely right" followed by a more precise version of the same thing, and the cautious one with shorter, quieter observations that proved, consistently, to be the most structurally important. It was the cautious one who mentioned, almost as an aside, that the eastern wall had cracks running in a pattern that suggested it would eventually fall in the direction of the barracks' ruin rather than inward, which meant the safest position during a collapse would be the northern corner near the thermal channel. It was the cautious one who noted, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting a weather observation, that the raptor Marin had heard calling earlier that morning had a nest on the southern cliff face and became aggressive during the mid-morning hours and would need to be accounted for on her descent. She wrote this down and looked up and said, "Thank you, that is genuinely useful." The cautious one dipped its head in the same small formal bow they had made over the figs. "You shared food," it said simply. The logic was complete in 4 words, a reciprocity not of obligation but of proportion. You offered something valuable, here is something valuable. A perfect transaction conducted entirely without the awkwardness that characterized most human attempts at equivalent exchange. It was somewhere in the middle of all this, somewhere between the philosopher's theory about the pre-human foundations and the pedant's careful correction of the estimated depth of the hidden room, 7 feet, not 6 as the philosopher had claimed, measured by the pedant's own body laid heel-to-tail tip twice with an additional half-length, which was, Marin admitted to herself privately, a remarkably rigorous methodology, that she reached into her pack and took out the rest of what she had. She did it without ceremony, which she understood instinctively was the correct approach. She laid out on the stone between them what remained of the bread, the last of the figs, the piece of hard cheese she had been intending for her own lunch, and the dried meat, and she divided it all into 4 equal portions, 3 for them and 1 for herself, and began to eat her own share in the same unhurried way she always ate on long walks. There was a silence. Not the silence of uncertainty this time. A different quality of silence, something she found more difficult to name, that sat in the gray morning air of the ruined hall with a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. The 3 of them looked at the 4 portions, looked at her, looked at each other. The philosopher made a sound she hadn't heard before, very quiet, low, somewhere between a hum and a purr, lasting perhaps 2 seconds, and then all 3 of them lowered their heads in the small formal bow and began to eat. The hard cheese required some negotiation. The pedant had strong opinions about the structural approach, preferring to work at it methodically from the softest edge, while the philosopher simply bit directly into the center with a confidence that suggested either considerable jaw strength or a willingness to experience difficulty as a consequence of directness. The cautious one sat with its portion and applied pressure in several different places with systematic patience, eventually discovering a fault line that allowed it to crack the cheese cleanly into 2 smaller pieces, and then continued from there with the focused efficiency of someone who has done their analysis and is now executing the plan. Marin watched this and ate her own portion and said nothing for a while, which was one of her better qualities. The ability to be quiet inside an experience without needing to narrate it, without reaching for words to pin it down before she had finished living inside it. Eventually, the philosopher finished the cheese and looked at the notebook. "You said you are here to understand the place," it said. "Oh yes. Do you come back to places you have understood, or do you go on to other places?" Marin considered this. "Usually I go on," she said, "but I come back sometimes to places that deserve it." The philosopher appeared to weigh this, and does this place deserve it? She looked around the great hall, at the half-arch and the open sky and the deep green moss and the collapsed timber suspended at its permanent diagonal, at the carved lintel with its unidentifiable figures, at the 3 small creatures arranged before her on the cold stone, scales catching the flat gray light, amber eyes attending her with a quality of regard she was still trying to accurately name, and suspected she might spend a considerable amount of time attempting to articulate in the pages of her notebook. "Yes," she said, "I think it does." The philosopher made the quiet hum-purr sound again. This time the pedant made it too, a beat later, a slightly different pitch, and the cautious one after a moment added a 3rd tone, and the 3 of them together produced something that was briefly, for perhaps 4 or 5 seconds, a chord. Not a tune, not a melody, nothing so structured as that. A chord in the sense of tones chosen to coexist, to reinforce and complicate each other, to produce together something that none of them produced alone. It was warm and strange and resonant, and it faded in the gray air of the ruined hall like the last note of a bell, not cut off but gradually becoming indistinguishable from silence. Marin realized she had stopped breathing for the duration of it. She exhaled carefully, made a note in her notebook that said only 3 voices, chord, tilde 5 seconds, and then sat looking at the note for a moment before adding underneath it, "Cannot adequately describe." "What was that?" she asked quietly. "Contentment," the cautious one said, in the same matter-of-fact tone it used for everything, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world to produce a spontaneous 3-part harmony as an expression of emotional state, as though all creatures did this, and the only unusual element was being asked to explain it. They stayed together through the rest of the mid-morning. The conversation moved at the pace of the light, which was the pace of a gray sky going incrementally paler, slow, undramatic, continuous. The philosopher had questions about the notebook and about writing and about weather. When a person wrote a word down, the word could hear itself being written, which led to a discussion of language that was one of the stranger and more genuinely stimulating conversations Marin could recall having. Largely because the philosopher's assumptions about how language worked were different enough from her own to make her question things she had never previously considered questionable. The pedant wanted to know about maps specifically, and received a brief explanation of cartography that it immediately began to interrogate with the focused precision of someone who has identified several possible sources of systematic error and intends to address them all. How did one account for the curvature of the Earth on a flat surface? If two mapmakers walked the same ground independently, would their maps agree? What happened when something on the map changed? When a river moved, or a road was abandoned, or a fortress fell into ruin, did the map die, or did it become a different kind of truth? This last question was so good that Marin stopped and wrote it down verbatim before answering, and told the pedant that it was a question cartographers had been arguing about for centuries. And the pedant received this information with the particular satisfaction of someone who has suspected for some time that the established discipline is less resolved than it presents itself to be, and has now received confirmation. The cautious one asked fewer questions. It listened, mostly attended to the conversation with the focused patience of a creature that processes by absorbing rather than by interrogating, and occasionally offered observations that were short and dense and required thinking about after the fact. It noted at one point that Marin touched the left pocket of her jacket periodically throughout the conversation and asked what was in it. She took out the compass, held it out. All three of them leaned forward simultaneously, nostrils working, and the philosopher extended a careful claw and touched the brass case very lightly. And the needle inside swung minutely with the change in proximity, and all three of them stared at this with the concentrated wonder of creatures encountering something they cannot immediately explain. "It finds north," Marin said, "always, no matter where you are or which direction you're facing." "How?" the philosopher said, not a question exactly. More the sound of a mind encountering a concept it needs to walk around several times before approaching directly. "Magnetism," Marin said. "The Earth itself is a kind of magnet. The needle wants to align with it." "The Earth pulls it." "In a way, yes." The philosopher sat with this. "The Earth pulls things," it said slowly, working something out. "Rain falls because the Earth pulls it. Rivers run downhill because the Earth pulls them. The compass points north because the Earth pulls it." A pause. "The Earth is full of wanting." Marin looked at the compass in her hand and then at the philosopher and did not say anything for a moment. "I have never thought of it that way," she said finally, "but I don't think you're wrong." The cautious one made the quiet sound again, the single-voice version of the chord. A brief low hum that lasted 2 seconds and then was gone. She was just reaching for her pencil to write down "the Earth is full of wanting," because it was the kind of phrase that needed to be written down, that belonged in a notebook the way the compass needle belonged pointing north, pulled there by something larger and more permanent than preference, when the shadow fell. It came from above and behind her, and her first awareness of it was not visual but thermal. A drop in temperature of perhaps 3 or 4 degrees, abrupt enough to feel like stepping into shade, except that she was already in shade, already under the gray overcast sky, and there was no direction from which additional shade could reasonably be expected to arrive. Her second awareness was the quality of the silence. She had been sitting in the comfortable silence of a conversation that has found its rhythm and does not need to fill every moment with words. This was a different silence entirely. It arrived like a physical thing in absolute cessation, and it came from the 3 small creatures before her who had been, one moment, attending her with the relaxed and curious focus of the past 2 hours, and were now in the same moment that the temperature dropped, completely and utterly still. Not the stillness of attention, the stillness of instinct, the stillness that lives in animals below the level of thought, that fires before the mind has caught up, that says in the language older than any language, "Something has changed and you do not move until you know what." All 3 of them were looking behind her. The amber eyes, which she had spent the morning watching shift through curiosity and satisfaction and wonder and the specific pleasure of a good argument, had changed. They were wider, deeper. Something in them had recalibrated, pulled back from the immediate and personal and present into something much older and more primary. The way a lamp turned low reveals the room it was always already in, larger and darker than the circle of light suggested. The philosopher's tail had stopped its restless curling entirely. The pedant's wings, which had shifted and resettled throughout the morning in small unconscious adjustments, were locked against its back with a compression that looked almost painful. The cautious one had lowered itself by perhaps an inch, a motion so slow and so controlled it was barely perceptible, the automatic posture of a creature that has learned to make itself smaller when what is behind it is very, very large. Marin felt the warmth of a breath on the back of her neck. Not a human breath, not the breath of any animal she knew. Warm as stone that has been in sunlight for an entire summer day, carrying a heat that felt stored rather than generated, radiated from something that had absorbed enough of the world's warmth over enough time that it gave it off continuously now, the way old stone walls release heat through the night long after the sun has set. It smelled of ash and deep earth, and something mineral she had no name for. Something that existed below ordinary smell the way very low musical notes exist below ordinary hearing, perceived more by the body than by any specific sense. She did not turn immediately. She turned slowly. She turned the way she had climbed the mountain that morning, testing each step before committing, keeping one hand on the wall, not from fear of what she'd find but from the deep instinctive understanding that some moments require approach rather than arrival, that the transition from not knowing to knowing is itself a thing that deserves to be done with care. She turned and looked up. The eye was the first thing she saw. It was amber like theirs, but the similarity ended there in the way that the similarity between a candle and the sun ends at both give light. The color was the same in the way that an ocean and a puddle share the quality of being water, technically accurate, practically meaningless as a comparison. The iris was vast, and the pupil had contracted to a vertical slit in the gray morning light, and the whole thing was regarding her from a height that required her to tilt her head back until the muscles in her neck were at their full extension, and she still could not see the top of the head that held it. She went still. Completely, entirely, absolutely still. Not from a decision, not from the application of courage or the override of fear. From the simple and total absence of any available action, the state that the body enters when it recognizes, at a level below all reasoning, that it is in the presence of something that exceeds every category it has been given to navigate the world, and that the only honest response to that recognition is to stop and be present in it, because there is nothing else to do and nowhere else to be, and the moment is larger than any response she could offer it. She stood in the ruined great hall of the Draveth fortress and looked up into an eye the color of amber and the size of a cartwheel, and did not move and did not speak and did not breathe. And the eye looked back at hers. The mother, the mind, Marin would think later, much later, in the long evenings when she sat with her notebook and tried to reconstruct the morning with the fidelity it deserved, performs a specific kind of mercy in moments of genuine overwhelm. It does not let you see everything at once. It cannot, not because it is weak, not because it fails, but because it is, at its core, a survival instrument, and survival instruments are practical things. They understand that a person who receives too much information simultaneously is a person who is likely to do something sudden and irreversible, and so they portion the impossible out, a piece at a time, digestible increments, the way a river cuts through stone not by the force of a single catastrophic flood, but by the patient, continuous application of water over time. First, the eye. The eye had been enough on its own, more than enough, a complete and sufficient piece of information that her mind had taken several full seconds to finish processing. Amber, vast. Ancient in the specific way that implied not duration but depth, the difference between something that has existed for a long time and something that has accumulated the world's weight over that time and carries it visibly. The way old trees carry their age not just in rings, but in the particular gravity of their canopy, the way they press down into the ground, as though they have earned the right to take up that much space. Then the jaw. It arrived in her awareness gradually, the way large things close to you resolve into scale only after you have been looking long enough for your eyes to recalibrate. The jaw was longer than the ledge she had been sitting on. She measured it instinctively against this reference point, the way cartographers are always measuring things. The habit so deep it operated even now, even in this. The scales along its underside were paler than those of the three small ones, closer to the color of weathered bronze than green copper, and they were worn smooth along the chin in a way that suggested age, not damage, not decay, but the wearing away that comes from decades of contact with stone and wind and the surfaces of the world, the same wearing that rounds the edges of old coins and softens the lettering on ancient grave markers. At the hinge of the jaw, where the scales gave way to a slightly different texture, there was a ridge of darker coloration that she would eventually understand was a scar, though at this moment she was still assembling the basic architecture of the face and had not yet arrived at its details. Then the neck, the chest, the shoulder. The wing was what finally made her understand the scale fully, the way that sometimes a single detail accomplishes what an accumulation of details cannot, makes the whole thing real in the complete sense, makes it press against the inside of her skull with the weight of something that cannot be unknown. The wing was half extended, which she understood later had been a deliberate choice, a posture of moderate presentation rather than full display. Half extended, it blocked a portion of the sky above the southern wall of the Great Hall. She could see it in her peripheral vision without turning her head. The membrane stretched between the elongated fingers of the wing structure, faintly translucent at its thinnest point in the way that very large ears are translucent when held up to strong light, the blood vessels visible as a branching network of darker lines. The bones were enormous. The span, even folded to half, was architectural. The other wing was held closer to the body on the far side, and she could see the articulation of its leading edge above the mother's shoulder like a second horizon line. A horizon made of bone and scaled skin, and the accumulated intention of something that had been alive for longer than the fortress that lay in ruins around them both. The mother dragon settled as Marin's stillness continued, not dramatically, not all at once. The way a very large animal settles when it has assessed a situation and found it provisionally unthreatening, a slow release of held tension in the major muscle groups, a lowering of the head by a degree that was small in absolute terms and enormous in practical ones, since the degree in question represented perhaps 2 feet of movement of a head that was the size of a small cart. The jaw came down. The neck curved in a line that was, Marin noticed with the part of her brain that continued to observe even when the rest of her was occupied with not dying of awe, genuinely beautiful, a long sweeping arc, controlled and deliberate, the movement of something that knew its own size and weight with complete precision and navigated space accordingly. The mother lowered her head until the eye, the vast amber eye with its contracted vertical pupil, was level with Marin's own. The distance between them was perhaps 8 feet, perhaps slightly less. Marin could see herself in the eye. This was not metaphor. She was literally visible in the reflection of the iris, very small, very human, cross-legged on the cold stone with her pack in her lap and her notebook open to a page that contained, among other things, the phrase "the earth is full of wanting." She could see the gray sky reflected in the same eye, and the broken walls and the open roof of the great hall, and the 3 small ones arranged in their careful semicircle behind her, visible in the eye as small bright points of amber light, as though the mother could see them there, could hold them and Marin and the entire hall simultaneously in a single field of awareness that did not require choosing what to attend to. The eye moved, subtly, fractionally tracking. It was assessing her in the methodical way she had watched the 3 small ones assess the bread, not with appetite, not with threat, but with the genuine and complete attention of something that needs to know what it is looking at before it decides how to proceed. She understood in the same wordless way that she had understood the bread needed to be left rather than handed, that she was being read. That whatever communication was happening in those slow, amber depths was real communication, not merely the instinctive chemical analysis of predator evaluating prey, but something more structured than that, more interested, more willing to arrive at conclusions that were genuinely open-ended. She did not look away. She had learned, in years of approaching uncertain animals in uncertain terrain, that there were 2 kinds of eye contact in the wild, the challenging kind and the present kind. The challenging kind said, "I see you and I am calculating whether I can take you." The present kind said, "I see you and I am here and I am not pretending otherwise." She held the second kind with every deliberateness she had, steady and open, not performing courage because she had none to perform at this precise moment, but offering instead the only thing she actually had available, which was honesty, the plain fact of her presence, neither inflated nor diminished, just, "Here I am, this is all of me, I have nothing to hide because I haven't had time to arrange a hiding." The nostril nearest to her opened and closed once slowly. A deep breath taken and released in a single controlled motion, the displaced air reaching her as a warm current that moved her hair and smelled overwhelmingly of that deep earth mineral warmth, ash and stone and something older than either. Something that lived at the very bottom of the smell the way certain notes in a chord live below the others, and provide the foundation that makes the rest of the structure possible. Then the mother looked past her, at the 3 small ones. Marin did not turn to watch this exchange. She could feel it happening behind her through the quality of the air, through the minute shifts and adjustments in the stillness at her back. She had spent enough of the morning understanding the 3 small creatures to know, without seeing, what was happening. The 3 of them were receiving a look that contained several things simultaneously, and they were responding to it with the mixture of guilty conscience and attempted reasonableness that young creatures deploy when they have done something technically within the rules, and are hopping the technically will be weighted appropriately. The silence stretched. Then she heard it from behind her, from the philosopher's direction, the sound of something small being pushed across stone. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see in her peripheral vision. The philosopher had moved the last small piece of hard cheese, the portion it had been saving, she realized, or perhaps the portion she had given it and it had not yet finished, and nudged it forward with its snout. Nudged it toward Marin. The gesture was unmistakable in its deliberateness and in its audience. The philosopher was not offering the cheese to Marin. It was demonstrating to its mother that the cheese was being offered to Marin. It was presenting evidence. Here is what we were doing here. Here is the nature of the transaction. We received, we also gave. We were not only taking, we understand the distinction. The pedant, after a brief pause that contained what Marin interpreted as the internal conflict of someone who agrees with a tactic in principle, but finds the specifics somewhat improvised, pushed forward its own small remaining portion with the air of someone who has decided that consistency is more important than personal opinion about methodology. The cautious one did not push anything forward. Instead, it moved slowly, very slowly, in the patient incremental way of a creature that understands that the speed of a gesture changes its meaning entirely, until it was positioned beside Marin rather than across from her. Not touching, not claiming, simply beside. The positioning of something that has decided on whatever basis it uses to make such decisions, which side it is on. Marin felt the motion more than she saw it, a warmth at her left side that had not been there before, a small and steady presence at the edge of her peripheral vision. She looked forward again at the mother. The mother was watching all of this. The amber eye had not moved from the whole of the scene, Marin, the cheese, the pedant's offering, the cautious one's repositioning, and it was taking it in with the same complete attention it had given Marin alone, absorbing each piece of information and adding it to whatever internal calculation was being performed behind that vast and ancient gaze. The process was unhurried. The mother was not a creature that rushed to conclusions. She had the patience of something that had made enough decisions over enough time to understand that the ones made slowly were generally the better ones. The scar, Marin let herself look at it now, since the mother was occupied with looking at other things. It ran from the base of the left horn, which was not the sharp decorative thing of story and illustration, but a solid ridge of darker scale that thickened from the skull in a curve like the prow of a ship, worn at its tip to a blunt point that suggested decades of contact with the world, down across the jaw in a long silver-white line, healed so completely and so long ago that it had become simply topography, a feature of the face the way a river valley is a feature of a landscape. Whatever had made it no longer mattered. What it said in the plain language of old scars was that this creature had encountered something significant, had been marked by it, and had continued. There was something about this that Marin found unexpectedly steadying. The mother lowered her head another degree. The eye was closer now, not alarmingly so, not in the way of a creature advancing with intent, but in the way of something choosing to be more present, to decrease the distance because the distance itself had become the thing requiring examination. At this range, Marin could see that the iris was not a single flat amber but layered, complex, with depth that was not merely optical. There were variations in the color, darker threads running through the gold, and at the very center, around the contracted pupil, a ring of something she could only describe as darker amber. A deeper, more internal gold, the color that amber achieves when it is very old and has had sufficient time to become entirely itself. The breath again warm, long, controlled. And then the thing Marin had not expected, the thing she would spend the most time afterward trying to find accurate language for, the thing she would eventually describe in her notebook with several attempts and crossings out before settling on a version that felt approximately, though never entirely, sufficient. The mother made a sound. It was not a roar. It was not a growl. It was not the theatrical vocalization of a creature announcing its power, which was the only category of dragon sound she had any reference for. It was low and resonant, and it started somewhere in the chest. She could see the vibration of it in the chest scales, could feel it traveling through the stone beneath her where she sat, the way very deep notes in music travel through floors and walls and into the body, and it rose and moved through the throat and emerged as something that occupied a register below ordinary hearing as much as within it. A sound perceived as much in the sternum and the feet as in the ears. A sound that had duration, perhaps 4 seconds, perhaps 5, and shape, in the sense that it was not flat and continuous but had an internal architecture, a movement through tones that never crossed into melody but conveyed undeniably meaning. Not meaning that Marin could translate, not meaning that arrived in her mind as words or images or any discrete cognitive content she could point to, but meaning in the oldest sense, emotional, physical, attitudinal meaning, the kind that bypasses language entirely and speaks to something that predates it. She felt it as something between acknowledgement and permission, between I see you and you may remain. Between the specific and conditional welcome, one creature extends to another when it has looked carefully at something and found it, not harmless exactly, but intended well enough. When it has decided that whatever uncertainty remains does not outweigh what is already evident. She was still holding her breath. She let it out. Behind her, she heard the 3 small ones exhale simultaneously, 3 thin, reedy sounds of released tension, so precisely synchronized that it would have been comic in any other context, and was, in this one, simply the sound of three young creatures who had been waiting for a verdict and had just received it. The mother held her gaze for another long moment. Then she raised her head slowly, that controlled tectonic motion that she brought to everything. The movement of something that does not need to rush, has never needed to rush, has been large enough and old enough long enough that urgency is simply not a category that applies, and turned. She moved away from Marin toward the far wall of the great hall with a deliberateness that was not dismissal but completion. The turn of attention away from something that has been assessed and found acceptable and can therefore be allowed to exist in one's peripheral awareness rather than one's direct focus. A reclassification rather than a withdrawal. She settled against the far wall the way a mountain settles, with the finality of something that has found its position and intends to occupy it for a significant amount of time. The great wings folded in stages, each stage a distinct and measured motion, the leading edge of each wing drawing back in, the membrane gathering, the whole vast architecture compressing with the controlled efficiency of something that has performed this action 10,000 times and has long since ceased to think about it. She lowered her head until it rested on the extended foreleg, a gesture so universally mammalian in its quality, so recognizable across every possible difference, that Marin felt something shift in her throat. The eye closed. Not entirely, not in the way of something that has fully relinquished awareness. The lid came down to perhaps a third, leaving a horizontal sliver of amber that still, Marin was almost certain, maintained a version of attention. The sleep, if it was sleep, was the sleep of something that never fully surrenders its sense of the world around it, that rests with one part of itself while another part continues its ancient and unbroken vigil. The great hall was quiet. Marin remained where she was. She remained for a long time, measuring her own capacity to hold stillness against the depth of what had just happened, and finding to her slight surprise that she had more capacity than she had expected. The morning had been doing something to her, she realized. The 2 hours of conversation, the careful negotiation over scraps, the philosopher's questions and the pedant's corrections and the cautious one's quiet, dense observations, all of it had been, among other things, practice. Practice in a particular quality of presence, an attentiveness without agenda, a willingness to be in something without immediately reaching for a handle that would let her carry it somewhere else. The cautious one was still beside her. She became aware of this again the way you become aware, in a quiet room, of a candle you had stopped noticing. Its warmth suddenly present again to your attention, neither more nor less there than before, simply returned to your awareness by the shift of other things. She looked at it. It looked back at her with its amber eyes that were smaller than its mother's, but had, she thought, the same quality in them. That same depth that suggested the color was generated from within rather than reflected from without. That same attentiveness that was not simply alert for danger, but something more actively interested in the world it inhabited. She comes and goes, the cautious one said quietly, indicating its mother with the briefest shift of its gaze. In the mornings she is away, she hunts in the high valleys, she returns before the middle of the day. She came back early, Marin said, keeping her voice at the same level as the cautious one's, the level of the hall's own silence. She always knows, the cautious one said, and this was not an explanation but a fact presented with the completeness of something that has never required explanation, that simply is. The way the compass needle simply points north because the earth is pulling it, and the needle has no opinion about this and the earth has no intention, it is simply what they each are, expressed in relation to each other. She's not angry, Marin said. She said it as an observation rather than a question, though it had some quality of both. No, the cautious one said. And then, after a pause in which Marin could feel it selecting its words with care, it added, she is careful, there is a difference. Marin looked at the closed eye, the three-quarters closed eye, the vigilant rest, and thought about this. Careful was not the word she would have reached for first, confronted with a creature of that size and power and age. But it was, she understood as she sat with it, the right word. What the mother had done was not display power, had not threatened, had not made any of the gestures that power, in her experience, generally found it necessary to make in the presence of something smaller. She had simply looked. Thoroughly, completely, without rushing, without flinching, without arriving at a conclusion before the looking was finished. And then she had moved away, which was its own kind of statement. I have seen enough to decide, and what I have decided is that you are not a problem, and therefore I will put my attention on things that require it more than you do. That was careful. That was, Marin thought, wisdom in one of its older and less discussed forms. The wisdom of the proportionate response, of neither overreacting nor underattending, of giving each thing exactly as much weight as it deserves and no more. The philosopher appeared at her other side. It moved with less care than the cautious one, with the comfortable directness of a creature that has already decided the situation is resolved and is now ready to return to the business of being curious. It settled itself and looked at the closed notebook in Marin's lap and then at Marin's face. Will you write about her? It asked. Marin looked down at the notebook. At the cover, worn at the corners, slightly damp from the morning air. At the pencil she was still holding had apparently been holding throughout, its tip worn to a softness that needed renewing. "Yes," she said. "What will you write?" She thought about this for a moment. About the eye and the scar and the breath and the sound that had traveled through the stone and up through her feet and into her chest, and said what it said in the language older than words. About the three-quarters closed lid and the meaning of careful and the difference between power and wisdom, and how rarely you got to see them occupying the same body with such complete ease. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I'll have to find out when I start." The philosopher considered this. "Writing is like hunting," it said eventually, with the tone of someone testing an analogy they've just assembled. "You don't always know what you're looking for until you see it." "Yes," Marin said, "exactly like that." From somewhere on the far side of the great hall, almost inaudible beneath the gray morning quiet, came the pedant's voice, having apparently begun a new examination of the far wall's structural issues and wishing to report its findings. The philosopher rolled its eyes, a gesture so perfectly human in its execution that Marin felt the almost laughter again, warm in her chest, and called back a brief response, and then looked at Marin with the expression of someone who has an obligation they are willing to accept and an opportunity they are unwilling to entirely release. "We will be here tomorrow," it said, 25 days if rain nights count." 24, Marin said, which earned her a look of such pure and uncomplicated delight. The look of a creature who has just discovered that the human can play the game, that she had to press her lips together very firmly to keep her composure. She stayed until the light shifted from flat gray to the slightly warmer gray that meant mid-afternoon had arrived and the mountain would begin its evening cooling within the next hour. She packed her things slowly and methodically, the way she always packed at the end of a day's work, notebook first. Compass returned to her left breast pocket where she felt it settle against her ribs, packed tightened and balanced. She took a last look at the sketch she had made of the hall from the top of the rubble slope, and added 3 small figures near the base of the collapsed archway, and did not label them, and then closed the notebook. The 3 small ones watched her prepare to leave with the particular quality of attention that she recognized now had been learning to read all morning, as something between observation and feeling, the way they had looked at the bread before she put it down. Not want exactly, something more complex than want, the anticipation of absence. She stood, adjusted the straps of her pack, looked at the 3 of them. "I'll come back," she said. The philosopher dipped its head, not the formal bow of the first meeting, but something less structured, more natural, the motion of a creature expressing something it doesn't yet have conventional language for. The pedant made a small show of not responding and then responded anyway, a single tail-tip curl that had immediately stilled as though hopping she hadn't noticed. The cautious one looked at her steadily with its amber eyes and said nothing, which was, she had come to understand, its way of saying the most. She turned and walked back through the great hall, stepping around the debris, ducking under the suspended timber, moving through the cool air and the gray light toward the base of the ruined stairs. At the top of the staircase she paused and looked back. From across the hall, through the gray morning light and the moss and the quiet, the 3 of them were still watching. Behind them, against the far wall, the eye, the 3/4 closed eye, the careful eye, was open a fraction wider than before. Watching too, or something close enough to watching that the distinction did not matter. Marin held this for a moment, let it settle in her chest alongside the compass and the warmth of the bread, and the chord and the phrase "the earth is full of wanting," and the sound that had come from the mother's chest, and traveled through stone, and meant something she would spend the rest of her life trying to accurately say. Then she turned and walked out of the ruins and down the mountain into the gray afternoon, alone, and carrying considerably more than she had brought up.